Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Radio Sofia, the platform for economic and social debates and discussions. The raging point of discussions since last 1.5 years has been the COVID-19 pandemic, which has disrupted lives and livelihood. And that is where a sneak peek into history would help us to make informed choices. To discuss on the history of pandemics and what India ought to have learned from that, we are indeed privileged to have amidst us Professor Chinmay Tumbe, Assistant Professor in the Economics area of IIM Ahmedabad. Having completed his Masters from the London School of Economics and PhD from IIM Bangalore, Professor Tumbe is a notable figure in the field of business and economic history with several publications in reputed international journals to his credit. Apart from that, after his bestseller on the history of migration titled India Moving, his recently published book, Age of Pandemics, 1817 to 1920, has been grabbing headlines, and he's going to discuss on some of his findings from the book today. Hope today's session could help us heal from what he calls the historical amnesia that Indians are suffering from. Thank you, Professor Tumbe, for accepting our invite, and we look forward to an extremely engaging discussion. Over to you.
Thanks a lot. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. You are audible.
Great. So thanks a lot for this very kind invitation. We are right now on June 18th, just emerging from the worst month in Indian history in demographic terms since November 1918. It's taken 103 years for such a catastrophe to emerge. Just to put it in context of what we've gone through, it is quite likely that May 2021 is the first month in maybe the last 5 decades where there were more deaths in India than births, which means it's quite likely that the Indian population fell for a very brief period in May 2021. Now, the official COVID numbers for the second wave are about 200,000. My work, others' work is showing that this is a massive underestimate. I can talk about that in the Q&A. But the reason I got interested in this topic is because when I was doing my research at IIM Bangalore many years back, and also after that, I kept coming across pandemics whenever I was researching history. It felt almost as if stuff like cholera, plague, and influenza were huge parts of the Indian kind of experience of the late 19th and early 20th century. And so the motivation for this book, which I'm going to talk about today, is really this context, which came about last year in March, when the WHO announced it as a pandemic. And suddenly, I was really concerned by the discussions happening in India. The context that time was many people said, oh, nothing can happen to us, so we are naturally immune. This immunity argument of Indians was played along for pretty much 10 months, I would imagine, until literally the second wave hit. Natural immunity or herd immunity, these are kind of words which were used on and off. And in March 2020, when I started hearing some of these conversations, or some people said, oh, pandemics have never started in India. I just realized that what I had seen in my research while on migration, not on pandemics per se, and the general collective consciousness, so to speak, was at huge variance. And that's when I decided to write this book. And so it's a book on past pandemics written during one. And I really wanted the book out in 2020. And, that's how it happened. Now, the book is about a period 1817 to 1920. It's called How They Shaped, the Age of Pandemics, How They Shaped India and the World. And the reason why it's important is not just for the context of the past, but also what it tells us for the present. And I'll just start off the discussion as to why two of the biggest crises that we saw in 2020 and 2021 were completely foretold by history. In the sense, if somebody tells you, oh, we could not have anticipated the migration crisis, well, this is an image from 1897 plague, where migrant workers rush onto a train going back from Bombay Station, captured by the Illustrated London. So, I'm putting these two images on your screen so you can see the same kind of anxiety and grief on migrant workers' faces as they are going back from the cities to the villages. And of course, a lot has changed in 100 years, but the fact is that the bulk of migration in India is circular. People have one leg in the city, one leg in the village. And when you get a health crisis in a pandemic, when you have a lockdown, when you have income security dry up, the first response of migrant workers is to go back home. And the reason I'm putting this chart out here is because from a public policy point of view, we took a particular decision of shutting down the Indian railways with a 4-hour notice period. And what history tells you is basically to do no such thing. In fact, the British, for all their other faults, which I'm going to list out at some length, did not shut down the Indian railways. In fact, they maintained special trains like this for migrant workers to go back. So, for example, during the plague in 1897, half of Bombay, about 400,000 people left Bombay city in those few weeks. And they, of course, returned. A few months later, they returned, just like what we saw is happening last year. Unfortunately for us, we shut down the railways first and then started it, the Shramik trains in May last year. And in those about 5 to 6 week period, what we saw were, deeply disturbing visuals of migrant workers walking back. In fact, if we had learned from our history in China in 1911, there was also a plague. They shut down the railways for their migrant workers, just like we did. And even back then in China in 1911, you got a humanitarian crisis. So history is not just, of course, just for its own kind of delight to read. I believe that our policymakers would have made significantly different choices if they had a better understanding of history. This is, of course, the second crisis, the second wave which happened this year, but I want to put it in historical context. When you hear people say, oh, we could not have anticipated the second wave, this is the chart I would like to point out to people. It's a chart which is in public domain for more than 2 years. It's coming from the work of Siddharth Chandra, who's done a lot of work on the influenza pandemic. I won't call it the Spanish flu. I will call it the influenza pandemic of 1918. But again, this is a chart which plots excess mortality, fever-related diseases in 1918 and November 1918. You'll see the peaks of this is November 1918. November 1918 is about as horrific as May 2021. Of course, many more people died back then. In the 1918 pandemic, we are saying that my estimates are about 20 million people died. 6% of India's population was wiped out. One of the world's greatest demographic disasters on record. But what I want you to see in this chart is the difference between the first wave and the second wave. So when people say, oh, we could not anticipate the rapidity of the second wave, well, that's exactly what history tells us. The history is useful because it shows you how bad things can get and how fast things can get. You can see, as the joke goes, this is not flattening again, this is flattening the curve, not on the x-axis, but on the y-axis, right? That's how fast these curves can shoot up. And this is exactly the kind of curves that you're seeing at the district level, what we've just seen in March, April, May 2021. You'll see that it goes up and it also comes down very fast, right? But when it goes up, there's complete chaos, right? And so if you were a policymaker at the end of the, as the first wave was receding after September, you had two options. One is to ramp up facilities like Dr. Rajendra Bharut in Nandurbar district, who saw what was happening around the world and said, look, these second waves are going to come. It's just a matter of time. And he started ramping up oxygen facilities in his district in September last year. Right? But the bulk of India started winding down containment, temporary relief centers started actually winding down. By the time you came to Jan and Feb this year, evidenceless triumphalism kind of shown through, where suddenly people said, oh, the pandemic is over. Health ministers on record saying we're in the end game of the pandemic. And again, this is why history is important, because what history tells us is that pandemics come in waves. Whether it was cholera for nearly a century in repeated outbreaks, whether it was plague for about 25 years of deadly kind of waves, seasonal, plague was seasonal. It came a few months every year, but it came for about 25 years in harsh intensity in India. And of course, the flu, which knocked out so many Indians that there's really not much more for the virus to do. And so two theories as to why it went out. One is herd immunity, because a huge part of India contracted the flu. But the other is that maybe the virus kind of mutated. These are the classic ways in which pandemics can end on their own without human agency. So this is the migration crisis of 2020, the mortality crisis of 2021 in historical context. And this is just to begin this discussion as to why history can be just such a powerful kind of teacher about the sample, the kind of things that can happen, and it kind of enables one to think about the worst case scenarios going in the future. Now, in this book, I have two main arguments. One, which I've already recounted, which is the second point on this slide, which says there's a huge value in remembering it. especially in India. India was the most knocked out country in those three pandemics, cholera, plague, and influenza. And so they are lessons of the past. And I'll come back to this right at the end. But also, if you're a student of history and if you love to read history, when we learn history in our school textbooks, when we think of this period, 1817 to 1920, and if you just close your eyes and think, okay, what happened in this period? Most likely, you're going to think about the freedom movement. Think of stuff like 1857 uprising, the rise of the Indian National Congress, and so on, the fall of the British by 1947, and so on. But what I'm arguing is actually the biggest event of this period was actually pandemics. To put it in very stark relief, suppose 40 years down the line, somebody tells you that the most important, event of 2020 and 2021 was, say, elections in India, right? You would say no. When we have lived through those times, and all our lives were centered around the pandemic, right? So if 40 years down the line, people completely forget the pandemic of 2021, you who have lived through it will find a dissonance, right? The problem when we are now in 2021 is that none of those people who lived in that period, or very, very few of them, are actually living today. So that entire memory, which was not systematically documented, has gone out of our heads. And this is what can happen in history when you've not written books, when you've not taken careful kind of documentation of that period. And that's an important argument of this book. That is, we need to understand history to develop collective memory, because an important part of dealing with pandemics is, public behavior, and behavior can be influenced by what we have in our head, or what can be called as collective memory. The side note, of course, is that this period is also known as the rise of the West. You might have heard of stuff like the rise, the global economic divergence, the share of Asia in global GDP falls, and so on. But what's less known is the demographic shock. That is, it's not just the share of economic output. The share of Asia's population falls in this period from about 65% of world population to 50%. Right? Now, that's a tectonic shift in the composition of global population. And pandemics is one part of the story. There are many parts to that story, but pandemics, I'm going to argue, is one part of that story. So for both these reasons, I think a book was really required, and that's why I've written this book. So to put the overall kind of picture, I'm talking about three pandemics: cholera, plague, influenza. Cholera kind of starts off in 1817 through a arguably virus, a bacteria kind of mutation. Just to give you a sense, cholera and plague are both bacteria-based diseases. Influenza is a virus. Note that the field of bacteriology itself emerged only in the late 19th century. Cholera, bacteria, was kind of identified systematically only in the 1880s. Plague in the 1890s. And influenza, when it struck 1918, people thought it was a bacteria. We now know it is not. So virology as a field developed only after. So remember, when these diseases hit them, they did not really even know what hit them. Influenza, people were just completely in the dark. It came and went. Nobody really had a clue. And the death toll was staggering. Now you'll see that the terminal date I've put is 1920. It doesn't mean that cholera, plague, disappeared after 1920, but the fact is that the intensity fell, right? And that's because of, a variety of things, both in terms of prevention, cure, in the case of plague, variety of other reasons which I'll talk about. And if you see the global estimates, 70 million people plus have died. This is more than, or roughly the same as World War I plus World War II casualties put together. Right? So imagine talking about the 20th century history without talking about World War I and World War II. I think most of you will agree in saying that that's nonsense. Those were pivotal moments, right? But most of you have probably never heard of this epoch in history called the age of pandemics, right? Despite it taking it a similar tone. And that's one interesting thing about pandemics, that they quickly fade out of memory. If you just see how we are behaving right now, after the disastrous second wave, if you see the world outside, it's almost like people just want to get back to their lives. Forget wearing masks and so on. That's how quickly pandemics can be erased, right, out of our memory. So that's an interesting observation. When you look at a class of natural disasters, say disasters, look at cyclones, earthquakes, wars, pandemics. Pandemics, I would argue, are the least remembered events. There's no clearly identifiable enemy. So that's one, key thing. For example, take the influenza. Influenza happens in late 1918, and about 20 million Indians die. Yet most of you probably never heard of it. Yet I'm sure all of you have heard of something called the Jallianwala Bagh tragedy. And that happens in April 1990. Now, a few hundred people die there, but we remember it. Why? Because it's a clearly identifiable enemy, the British. Right? And so it's kind of, that event is, memorialized. There are monuments built in it. That's how history is built. right? And so unfortunately for the influenza, nothing exists. And these 20 million numbers is just a number out there. And I come back to this thing about the estimate, because it's so important to get a decent estimate to understand how big that shock was, right? And right now I'm working on how many people died in 2021, and I'll come back to that argument later. So you'll see that India was the worst hit in all three in absolute terms. Okay, and I should also point out that even in this pandemic, when you adjust for underreporting factors, India unfortunately is now number one on the COVID-19 death toll, right? So if you see the charts, it's US, Brazil, India. You account for underreporting, India goes on top. And I'll come back to that, or we can take questions on that. In terms of percentage of population, okay, cholera probably affected Egypt more. So as countries go, Egypt probably lost more people as a percentage to cholera, but India lost a substantial percentage to cholera, plague, and influenza. So I'll start now. All these statistics that I'm giving you come from my own research, which is partly new estimations and also a lot of collation of past works, kind of a global kind of tabulation of what we know from those studies. And so while the book is one kind of a publication, there is a separate 90-page publication, if any of you are interested, which has come out as a working paper called Pandemics and Historical Mortality. So that's freely available online. And that book that working paper provides a statistical appendix as well as an extended bibliography. So one of the things I've done for the research of this book is to analyze death statistics from about 1860, when the first death statistics in India start to come about, to about 1940. Right? So that's a province level database I have on mortality statistics, because the British were very good with data keeping and so on. And that's enabled me to understand which parts of India were more affected, maybe why they were more affected, and so on. And so that's a lot of the stuff which I've done in the statistical sense. The book, of course, combines that statistical baseline research with the kind of actual memoirs, reports which were written on those times, the controversies, etc. Okay, so I'll start with cholera. And cholera is interesting because it breaks out in 1817, and it takes a long time, to move around. It breaks out in Eastern India. Cholera is a disease which has been there for a long time in history. All we are saying is that there seems to be a particularly virulent strain from 1817. We now know that it is waterborne, but back then people thought all diseases were airborne. So there's something called the miasma-based theory, whether it was Ayurvedic traditions, whether it was Western traditions, whether it was Unani, or Siddha in the South. There was some sort of an idea that impure air, right, causes diseases. This is a strong kind of medical tradition that was lasting in the early 19th century. And in the early 19th century, there was really no advantage that Western medicine gave for curtailing diseases in general. Right, this medical advantage of the West really starts about from the very late 19th century. Once bacteriology as a field comes about, that's when that advantage happens. So this map basically shows you dates where it's first observed. So Calcutta, it starts reported first in Jessore, 28th August, 1817. Then it goes, to Calcutta, and then it's kind of reported at different points, around, and it reaches Ceylon, you'll see Sri Lanka, in January 1819. So it's taken about 1.5 years to go from Calcutta to, and why? Because this is a world with there's no railways, there's no steamboats, there are no planes. So it's a world of slow kind of transport. So it takes time for diseases to spread, right? But when cholera came about in 1817-19, most people would say that the Anglo-Maratha War had a huge role to play in its movement. A lot of this was through troop movement. It overwhelmed, wherever it went, it overwhelmed the people. To give an example of what cholera really is a disease bacteria-based disease which causes dehydration. You lose a lot of yeah.
Small question. In the previous map that you just showed, the dates which are written over there. So is it the first case of reporting which is mentioned over there?
Yeah, first case of reporting. Yeah.
So 817 means 17 August 1800. Which year?
No, 17 is 1817, the year.
1817 August.
And 8 is the month.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Yeah, so if you see all the dates have either 17 at the end or 18 or 19. So that refers to the year 18. So if you look at Katak out here, that's 9-17. That's basically, September 1817, right? Only see, if you look, only Jessore has the full date, that is 28th August 1817, because that is considered to be like the first point of report. There's a particular judge who reported this in Bombay also has on 14th August 1818 and so on. So some have all day month here, but otherwise you should look at it as month and year. Yeah. Right. So it's like 1817, then the progression happens in 1818, and then by 1890. And then within the subcontinent, it kind of recedes, over time, but then it keeps breaking out over the next 100 years. And of course,
what was the first case of reporting for cholera in India?
So the thing is, cholera has been there throughout history, different ways of describing cholera, and I write that about in the book. What we're just saying is that it seems exceptionally virulent after 1870. There's really no clear explanation for this, apart from the fact that there's some sort of strain mutation, just like what we're seeing happen in India in the last 3 months. So this is a classic explanation of why a pandemic starts. What we are basically saying is we really don't know. Okay, and the most likely idea is some sort of a mutation which makes it lethal. In fact, my
point of asking was that since we know that cholera is waterborne disease.
Yeah.
So I did not understand how this disease was spreading all across India.
Good point. Yeah. So good point. So how does cholera transmit? I'm going to come to that, but I'll just point it out now. So classically, pilgrims, troop movements, these were considered. So think of it as this. Basically, cholera was observed often where high number of people congregated, especially in camps. Right? Camps were classic places where cholera broke out. Why? Basically, what people discovered is not just that it is waterborne, but what is called as a fecal oral transmission mechanism, which means what? You ingest it, right? So if you drink water, contaminated water, you get cholera. But then you pass a lot of stools, you keep going to the toilet. Right? Now, if that point of discharge from your body gets mixed up somehow with the drinking water, right? That is the classic way in which cholera comes back into the body. Now, often in camps, what happens is that the toilets and the drinking water places are pretty much integrated. Think of it as river shorelines. Right? So people are bathing in the same water. People are, defecating close to the river, and they're also drinking the same water. Right? And now again, think of pilgrim sites as the classic example, right? Pilgrim sites where people bathe, they drink the holy water. In fact, they take the water and go back to their villages and spread it to their ponds. So later, by the time we come to the late 19th century, officials made a systematic link between pilgrimages and the spread of cholera in North India. Right? So this is how you should think. It is not, you should not think it is okay, like it's flowing through a river. That could also happen. But it's more like, because people are using buckets and, kind of taking water in a very different fashion back then. It's not really pipeline-based water. And so not surprisingly, the way to end cholera, which the West discovered, was to invest heavily in piped water supply and ensure that piped water supply, the source was separate from the place where the sewage was basically going. And so I hope that explains. So what we're saying is campsites in particular, whether it was, famine-based campsites, whether it was pilgrim-based campsites, whether it was military-based campsites, these were classic ways in which cholera. And you'll see out here, for example, on this map, you'll see Hastings Army, November 1817. In my book, I cite Hastings. Hastings, Mark Hastings, this British, army person, he basically took a shot. He's saying the cholera is, is ripping through our camps. We don't know what is causing it, but there could be some idea that it has something to do with water, right? And so he has this intuition, he's not proving the theory, he just has an intuition. And they basically move to another site and drink water from another site. And he says that seems to be working. So the people are using kind of some intuition as to what might be the cause of cholera, though there's no, established scientific process. All right, so cholera is about dehydration. This is just, it's very quick. To give you a sense of numbers, case fatality ratios were usually above 50%, which means if you got cholera, there's a good chance that you would die, and you could die very quickly. So by the time you got cholera and died, sometimes it would just take 4 hours. So it was very deadly, right? This is, how a face, you get sunken eyes, the face would change. Now, cholera gets out of India through these routes that I mentioned, and by the 1830s starts devastating Europe, right? And so Europe is completely, all the leading sites like London, a lot of cities in Germany, completely devastated by cholera. Russia is a huge place where cholera caused a lot of havoc. And this is just to tell you that nobody really knew what was happening. So it's a kind of a cartoon image which shows, this person barricading himself against, as it says, useless advice concerning protection against cholera. Because everyone had something to say about cholera, but nothing really seemed to work. Okay, this is when cholera comes to US. this is a cartoon from 1866, nationwide outbreaks. You'll see, this is again, the economic impact of this. People leave the city. And so that, this person is saying, you'll have to come down with your rents. I intend to occupy these premises myself. Right now, cholera hits USA very hard in 1832, 1849, 1866. In fact, it also claims the life of an American president, though not while he was a sitting president, just a few months after he leaves office. And cholera, when it comes to Europe and US, by the way, it is called Indian cholera, right? So India cholera. So it's like people call it the Chinese virus this time around. The name of the country was often attached. So for literally a century, India was seen as the source of this great pandemic. And so again, to this idea that India has never been the generator of pandemics and so on, we now know, of course, that not each and every outbreak could be linked to India, but there's no doubt that as the epicenter, Eastern India seemed to be the particular region, right? And so unfortunately, India got this very bad name associated with diseases across much of the 19th century. Okay, Egypt, as I said, was a country which was really devastated. Almost 10% of its population, gets wiped out thanks to cholera. Again, an image from the late 19th century to show this. Showing you this image from Russia, just to point out how important cholera was to start off the quarantining system. Now, so today we have the word lockdown. Lockdown was not a word used in the 19th century. Quarantines were in fashion. And again, you'll see people leaving a distance, what we would today call as physical or social distancing. And this is in Russia. Russia also lost a lot of people to cholera. The famous music composer Tchaikovsky is also said to have died of cholera, as his mother. Now, this thing about cholera transmission, the most famous way in which cholera was understood was by John Snow. And John Snow in 1854, pointed out his classic study, looking at a map saying, oh, it seems to be a waterborne disease because, two ways he established this. One was the Broad Street pump, that a lot of deaths were around that contaminated pump. And then another way in which he did this classic experiment was to see two water companies providing, water to the neighboring houses, classic randomized kind of experiment, and saying one water company was getting from its source close to where the sewage was dumped. And it's in those houses where cholera was, more. So that's how we kind of established this waterborne. Now, interestingly, while the waterborne theory was established in the 1850s, the officials in India, the British officials in India, did not believe that. Okay, so for another 40 years, millions of deaths in India happen literally because the British are stubborn to basically deny the plausibility of the waterborne transmission. Right? And so I'm showing you this map because it's a very interesting way of how officers were arguing for the waterborne theory. This is a map drawn in a pamphlet of 1887 from MC Fernell, who was in the Madras presidency, medical kind of officer. He wrote this kind of a booklet called Cholera and Water in India. And he was saying, look, please listen to me. John Snow has already said this. The world has moved, but we are not. Cholera has a water connection. And this map is very fascinating. He points out a caste level kind of residential map in a village in South India. And he says, look, there in this, on one side of the street, you have the high castes living, in his words, and the other side, you have the low castes. And he points out well number A and well number B. And he says in this village, because these wells were contaminated with cholera, only people fell sick of cholera on this side of the street. Right? And because the other guys were having water source outside the village, they were kind of unaffected. And the one person who seems to have been affected from the place where the low castes were living was the washerman who would work on the other side of the street. So he's kind of providing clinching proof of, look, it's got to do with water. Right? So John Snow used, water pipe companies, and, this officer in India uses a caste level residential map. And I think it's a great device to kind of, show it to research students, especially. So I found this very fascinating, but MC Fernell, by most accounts, lost his job. That's how stubborn the officials were, the British officials were in India in the reception. That's how strong the miasmatic theory of diseases was. It was really the 1890s, when the microscopes got improved, when the kind of evidence started piling on that, cholera is definitely waterborne, that finally officials in India moved. Though, of course, piped water starts entering Calcutta by 1869 in the British areas, and you can see cholera, death rates start falling after that. Right? So in the place which was most affected, which is Calcutta, there was some improvement precisely because of pipe water. But pipe water is not there everywhere, right? And especially in much of India, it was simply out of bounds. Now, vaccination is an important story and starts in a big way around the world for the disease called smallpox in the 19th century. But Valdemar Haffkine, after which Haffkine Institute in Bombay is named, comes and he's a kind of a hero. Just like we have the Serum Institute of India today, the Haskell Institute was a kind of played a pioneering role in vaccine development. And this is an image kind of showing anti-cholera inoculation in Calcutta in 1894. Plague breaks out in India a few years after that, and Haskell is persuaded to stay back in Bombay. And so that's why he starts his research on plague. And then he gets a vaccine for plague also. Now, these vaccines were not effective. I mean, their effectiveness percentages were not as high as the kind of vaccines we see today, but they were useful. It was unlikely that you would completely, evade the disease through that. But there was a lot of marketing done for vaccination. The same issues that we face today: vaccine hesitancy, adverse events. Haskell was sidelined because he was convicted for a alleged kind of misadventure on vaccines. He was later cleared. It turned out that it was not his fault. The vaccines were fine. It was the implementation stage which went wrong, and about 18 or 20 people died in Punjab. And that issue got huge kind of a flare up. And that's a huge lesson from history. That is, any mass vaccination rollout will have adverse events, but how you manage the publicity of those adverse events is very important. Right? And this is huge. We've not yet seen that happening, thankfully, in India today. But as the vaccination goes up, we're going to see a few adverse events, and how we kind of control the fallout of those adverse events is very, very important, because that's what we learned from this particular incident. That was in the case of the plague vaccines. I'll just also point out the link of history and today. It is quite plausible to say that the Serum Institute of India would simply not have been existent today if Valdemar Haskell did not come to India, in the late 19th century. There's a clear link between Haskell and Serum Institute, because Haskell, started this lab in Bombay, which was then called the Haskell Institute, and the Serum Institute was started by the Poonawallas. And the Poonawallas, as you know, horse breeders, had nothing to do with vaccines. But in the 1960s, they started dealing a lot with the Haskell Institute. Why? Because they had to buy certain kind of equipment to basically treat their horses, because the horses would fall prey to snake bites, and so they required certain kind of antidotes for that. And the Haskell Institute provided that. And it's in that connection with Haskell Institute that the Serum Institute idea was born. So it's kind of a backward integration from horses going back to vaccine production via Haskell Institute. And of course, today we see what's interesting is Serum Institute is a big producer of vaccines, and Haskell Institute has now got the license, by the way, to ramp up its production scale. But 100 years back, the Haskell Institute was like the Serum Institute today. It was a very well known around the world. Those plague vaccines were also exported back then. And it also tells you what this idea of India being the vaccine pharmacy of the world and so on has roots in history. And I would say, Valdemar Haskell is probably the biggest name in that respect. So how was cholera finally won? 4 important people, John Snow showing that cholera is waterborne, Robert Koch, identifying the bacteria systematically. Leonard Rogers in Calcutta, he just experimented with intravenous or IV treatment methods. He basically said, look, if dehydration is the problem, you need rehydration. And so he tried all these IV kind of treatments, and he got down the case fatality ratios from 50% to below 20%. So from the 1910s onwards, suddenly cholera stopped becoming a very dangerous disease. In the sense, even if you got cholera, you didn't have to die. The real breakthrough on cholera, by the way, happens very late. It happens by a scientist based in Calcutta, who ought to have won the Nobel Prize, a person called Sambhunath Dey, who really identifies what does cholera do, also showed why Robert Koch was wrong on certain counts. And it's thanks to his work that really better vaccines came about, and ultimately what is now today known as oral rehydration therapy, ORT, which is one of the most cost-effective ways, by the way, to get rid of cholera. So cholera, we are saying today, has stopped becoming an important disease to be concerned with because of both prevention and cure. It's a pandemic. We call it a pandemic because it went around the world, right, simultaneously. Unlike, say, malaria, which is considered to be an epidemic or an endemic kind of disease, cholera is considered to be a pandemic, and which kind of really ends through prevention and cure, right? Prevention on the water supply, pipe water supply, and cure in terms of ORT, to some extent vaccination. I come now very quickly to plague. When plague hits, plague is, of course, a disease which has tormented humanity. It is the most maybe the most written about disease in history before 19th century, simply because you've probably heard of the Black Death, 14th century plague hitting Europe. Plague, I'm right now based in Ahmedabad. Plague has hit India often. The classic way to identify plague was to see rats dying. So if you saw rodents dying, that's a sure shot that you'd get plague. It was very terrifying because bubonic plague, you start growing these buboes or these big sort of black color boils on your body. So it's also a disease which was terrifying visually. See, unlike the flu or unlike the coronavirus, where you get a fever, plague was terrifying just because you could see the disease in a very visual sense. And it hit Ahmedabad in the early 19th century, but it really comes to Bombay in 1896, most likely from Hong Kong. And it was tormenting China for much of the late 19th century. It also torments Egypt for much of the 19th century. So it's not like it comes out of the blue. But what is interesting is the European response. The plague is the first time that the Europeans go overboard, especially the British in India, to contain the disease. And they get into every aspect of day-to-day life. Right? This is mass surveillance. And the biggest legacy which we're still dealing with is a piece of legislation called the Epidemic Disease Act of 1897. Right? And that's how the British really try and control. Now, what's interesting is why the British do this. The British have the memory of the plague, and that's why I'm talking about collective memory in this book. They are obsessed about plague because they have faced it. They have faced it in the Black Death of the 14th century, and they have faced it in London in the 1660s Great Plague. Right? So they know that plague is a horrible disease, and Europe has last seen plagues in a serious sense, only in the 1720s. So they're doing everything to keep plague out. And that's how they go overboard. Okay, this is just a kind of photograph to show you the classic responses, the equivalent of Corona, go, which we heard last year, that is, prayers and trying to escape from diseases. But plague brought about extreme surveillance from the British, extreme intervention in day-to-day lives. And on hindsight, we now know that it was completely unwarranted because what they had not figured out was transmission. And that's also a lesson that is, without investing in understanding the transmission of the disease, often people do stuff on gut feeling, but very quickly the science tells you that a lot of that is simply not required. Right? So at the time that the British were doing all this is 1897, for example, kind of disinfecting a person and so on, people actually thought that plague is a disease coming from filth, in the sense that it's somehow something to do with the air. We now know that plague enters the human body, typically bubonic plague enters the human body from rodents to humans via the bite of a rat flea or a particular kind of a flea, right? And so it's a particular kind of rat and a particular kind of flea that matters, right? And so this knowledge came very late in the day. That is, we're saying almost 10 years after the pandemic started, right? So it starts in 1896 in India in a big way, but it's only between 1905 and 1910 that the transmission, which is an epochal moment, because remember, plague has tormented humanity throughout history, and finally people understanding of what plague is all about. A photograph of a temporary hospital in Bombay. We see similar images today on this. I'll talk about the regional variation of the pandemic in India. Plague, the biggest impact was in India. And I'm showing this map because one of the things we've observed in the last 1 year is the obsession of everyone, right? From all of us have done this at some point. We ask this question, why have some places been more affected by the disease than others? Right? And we have all sorts of explanations, right? So for COVID, my favorite hypothesis, which I don't believe in, is what I call the Pani Puri hypothesis. That is, if you can eat Pani Puri outside, you get some sort of a strange immunity, and that protects you against coronavirus. And this, I've heard this in countless conversations over the past year. Now, in the case of plague, it's very interesting because, the people in Calcutta and Madras were often saying, we're doing a much better job of dealing with the disease, right? Now, it turns out that what matters for plague transmission is a particular kind of rodent and a particular kind of rat flea, and that disease ecology was simply not quite there in South India and East India. Another way of saying is that the disease ecology was simply non-existent in the early 20th century for the disease to make a major impact in Eastern India and Southern India. Another way is saying that Eastern and Southern India just got lucky. Right? And Western and Northern India in particular, you'll see along the Western Ghats and pretty much along the Ganges, the Ganga, you'll see that much of the plague mortality was very high. Punjab was the most hit province, United Province or Uttar Pradesh was second, and Bombay Presidency. So we often think of plague also as being a very urban disease, or it hit Bombay city, because all the classic information we get is about Bombay city. But plague really hit rural India very hard, partly because a lot of the people were living in kacha houses. The rats very easily basically form, their particular ecology around those kind of houses. And so that became a classic transmission mechanism. And that's why later on people realized that a good, effective way to keep plague away is rat proofing. Right? So if you can keep the rats away, that's one way of getting away from plague. The other important thing in terms of prevention was traditional wisdom. Because plague has been there throughout history, Indians actually had a kind of natural response to plague. And that was very interesting. What they did was basically, especially in the villages and small towns, they camped outside during the night. Right? And no, the British never really understood why they were doing it. This was just purely out of intuition that it seemed to work. That is, if you don't sleep in the village, if you sleep in small camps outside the village during the plague season, as people called it, then that kind of improved your chances of living. It turns out that actually now has a scientific reason, and that is that the rat flea in particular is quite sensitive to light, right? And so the most of those bites, so to speak, happen during the night. So if you stay away from the rat flea ecology during the night, and if you're there during the day, you can actually reduce your chances. And this is a remarkable traditional wisdom, which the British saw, initially smirked upon, then learned, and that's what they advocated for about 10 years. So between 1900 and 1910, the way to beat plague was to camp outside the villages for at least 3 or 4 months of the year, the so-called plague season, right? And that's how you beat plague, right? And later on, of course, people started investing more in rat proofing and so on. Now, plague eventually, this is an example of a plague vaccination certificate with no leaders, photograph. That's the only probably difference between then and now. Plague also goes around the world, but it doesn't really hit Europe and North America too much. It hits Brazil a little bit. Brazil gets one of the best scientists that they have to control it, and kind of it's considered to be the start of their modern public health system in response to plague. It also hits South Africa. Gandhiji is out there at that point, so he's also involved in some of that stuff. Plague hits China. So apart from India, China is the worst hit, badly hit by plague. Showing you this picture because it shows you this PPE, the early versions of PPE and how they try to deal with it. In 1911, by the way, was this time when they shut down the trains for migrant workers, leading to a humanitarian crisis. Now, how was plague won eventually? I'll start with, of course, a tribute to Savitribai Phule, who's a famous social reformer in India. And also because, typically we don't show women, but women scientists and so on in history, but women were, in a way, the frontline workers in all the past pandemics, right? In the sense, in terms of nursing, in terms of caregiving, and often women had more mortality because of that, right? In terms of mortality rates. So Savitribai Phule actually died of the plague after starting a plague clinic, right, for the poor and so on. And so tremendous service, given by her. Kitasato and Yersin are the people credited. This might interest for those who live in the world of academic publishing and so on. They both kind of published their results in the same month, right? And so in a way, they both independently identified the plague bacteria, in 1894. By the way, a lot of these scientists started visiting India in that time as well. But the real hero in the story, if you ask me, is a Secunderabad-born person called William Liston. And William Glenn Liston, born in India, medical officer in the British service, he was obsessed with this idea of what causes plague. And the first plague commission reports in India discounted the possibility of the rat and rat flea. And it's a remarkable paper this guy writes in the Indian Medical Gazette. It's one of the classic papers of all times, I think, with simple kind of observational techniques points out, using this example of what he was analyzing in Bombay, of why it has to be the rats and the rat fleas and human connection to cause plague. And it's because of his paper that from 1905 to 1910, more kind of experiments were done to prove his theory. And that's when they kind of established the transmission link. Once the transmission link is identified, suddenly people know how to deal with plague in terms of keeping it out. Right? And a huge industry develops in India of rat catching, rat extermination. Some of it, that legacy is still there in many of our municipal populations. Now, how does plague go out? Of course, a lot of people played important roles, but I should point out that the pandemic per se reduces across India at the same time. And it happens arguably because of herd immunity, not amongst humans, but among the rodents. And so epidemiologists basically point out that there's some sort of a host bacteria relationship, an equilibrium, and plague kind of comes in cycles. And so it's quite possibly the reason that herd immunity among rodents actually led to the ebbing of plague across time. Of course, better vaccines, DDT sprays, Antibiotics by the 1940s, had a major role to cut down plague. And the last real cases of plague in India were in 1960s. There was, of course, a plague outbreak in Surat in 1994. I distinctly remember that, but that was nipped in the bud. And of course, a lot of controversy around that. I come to the disease which is most, it resembles coronavirus the most because it's a virus, not a bacteria. Of course, it came in two devastating waves, and the second wave in particular hit India tremendously. Okay, so this I've already shown you, the first wave and second wave. For anyone who thinks second waves can't be anticipated and so on, this is a good chart to show in terms of how different waves can look from time to time. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the numbers. How many people died of influenza in 1980? And obviously you'll appreciate this question because that's exactly what we're asking right now. How many people died in the second wave or in the overall pandemic in India today? And I'll start with this newspaper article in the Times of India in 1990. This was the first estimate provided by the health official of that time, Norman White. And he did a quick kind of calculation using just kind of category called fever. And because remember, there's no testing, right? You couldn't test yourself for influenza. Today, we have an absurd situation where the government basically says you can be classified as COVID dead only if you have tested COVID positive, right? Which means for a huge part of India, which is out of the testing remit, you simply cannot be classified as COVID dead, right? You had a much more commonsensical approach in 1918, actually, if you ask me, than in 2021. And so the number this guy arrived at was 6 million. Now, 6 million, of course, even he acknowledges in his report, by the way, saying that, 6 million is an underestimate, right? Why? Because the entire system collapsed. You had bodies floating, clogging the Ganga. You had corpses being thrown in jungles. But as per Jim Corbett, that's how a lot of, leopards turned into man-eaters because they started, eating the corpses. You have, oral history testimonies of absolute chaos, right? And just like we saw in April, May this year, the government system basically collapsed and it was civil society helping each other. So if this year we had Twitter, WhatsApp to kind of, ferry around oxygen cylinders, medicines, back then they had, the equivalents of those times. And I found one of them, the letter to the editor. And if you see the letter to the editor newspapers of those times, you'll see they're not appealing for help from the government. They're appealing to help from welfare associations, from, Seva Mandals and so on, saying, please come to our district and help us. Because this complete faith in the government had been eroded. So 6 million deaths, but this number was revised upwards by the census officials. So the way to kind of get to the deaths, there are two methods, the excess deaths method, but another way is the census, because when the census officials went in 1921, they just found a lot of villages depopulated, right? And so you can now use an intercensal growth method to see how many people died. And I've used that estimation to revise the number up now to 20 million, right? Of course, there are various, if you see my working paper, I have a table of all the different estimations, but even if you don't believe my number, most researchers are now narrowing it down to 15 to 20 million. Okay, that's about 5 to 6% of India's population. Alfred Crosby, the American historian, points out that this is probably the largest demographic shock ever received by the human species. Right? That's how big the influenza global toll was, and India as the epicenter of that. Okay, so it was a massive pandemic. How does it look like? This is just a simple chart of Indian population growth rates from 1911 to 1921, and yellow, dark yellow means, very extreme negative population growth in the jurisdiction boundaries of today. So obviously India did not look like this, back then, but what I'm doing is recasting that data in today's district boundaries. And I have this chart in my PhD thesis, by the way, when I was looking at migration. So this is, if any of you are doing a PhD, this tells you how valuable PhD thesis can be sometimes. And you'll see that much of Western and Northern India, Rajasthan, Central India, Madhya Pradesh in particular, was completely knocked out by the influenza. Okay, not much in Eastern India, not much in Southern India. And so there's a mystery of why so many people died of influenza only in Western and Northern India and not Eastern and Southern India. And so I've investigated this, and there are two theories. And the reigning theory was a temperature-based theory. And this theory basically said, look, influenza came when it was quite cold in October, November, and influenza developed pneumonia kind of complications. So it's in the colder climates in Western and Northern India that more people died. And so I.D. Mills, gave this famous argument. I don't agree with that simply because cross-country evidence shows very little, evidence of temperature being an important explanatory factor. What, in fact, I'm arguing is that 1918 was a unique year in Indian history, which was the influenza was preceded by India's third worst drought in recorded history. Right? And so what I've done is to code at the district level the kind of standard deviation of rainfall in India. And there's a kind of a very clear overlap, that is, it is in those districts where there was an acute shortage of water, a drought, where you got the massive mortality of influenza. What I'm basically saying is that while influenza went across India, whereas the case incidence ratios were uniform, and we can get this because of data from the cantonments, data from the jails, where they kept records of how many people contracted influenza. The case incidence rates are fairly uniform across India, but the case fatality ratios, the people who died, those rates are much higher in Western and Northern India. In fact, in precisely those districts which face the drought. So what I'm arguing is that influenza worked upon extreme malnutrition and undernutrition caused by the drought. Okay, and that's why so many people died. So 20 million people need not have died. Okay? Now, typically, food grain management in India was, managed system, but the fact of 1980, apart from in the drought, was that this is also the time of World War I. And so the Indian Railways was pressed into effort for the war effort. Right? And so when I looked at the reports across provinces, people are pleading with the government saying, can you please send us food grains through the railways? But they can't because the railway wagons are doing some other things, that is taking equipment for the war effort. So they go into the ports taking equipment towards Mesopotamia. So food grains were exported to Mesopotamia at the time when they were needed in India at that time. Very similar to the Bengal famine, when kind of rice imports from Burma was stopped because of World War II and so on. So in a way, inefficient food supply management aggravated the problem of influenza, just like oxygen kind of shortages in India in 2021 aggravated the problem of the coronavirus pandemic. So many lives could, but unfortunately they couldn't because of resource constraints. To point out as to how bad 1918 was and the economic impact of it, this is a chart which shows you GDP and inflation, GDP growth rates on the x-axis and inflation on the y-axis. In the last 120 years, before this year and last year, the worst year in Indian economic history was 1918, where GDP contracted by more than 10%. That's worse, by the way, than this year's shock. And inflation was surging at about 30%. So this was India's biggest supply side shock ever, because basically so many people died that, there were so many people got the flu that nobody really went to work for many months on it. Right? And so output collapsed. And the drought had an additional effect. This was mostly an agrarian economy, more than 60% of GDP was agriculture. So with that, the crop outputs failed, not only the Kharif crop because of the drought, but the Rabi crop because there were simply no workers in the fields. So this was a kind of unique kind of this thing. You'll also note that the next year, 1919, had a bounce back. That's simply a base effect, right? So obviously, if you have a 10% fall in one year, the next year things will get a bit better. And so you got 1919 as a slightly better. Okay, so you see 2020 is somewhere out here, about -8%. So what we're saying is that the two worst years of Indian economic history in the last 120 years are both pandemic years, 1918 and 20, which is, and when I was a student of economics, I never came across pandemics. I learned about the Great Depression, the US, not the India, the US Great Depression in my studies in economics. I never once came across pandemics in any class of my economics training for 10 years. Right? But what this chart tells you is that economists better gear up to understand what happens in the pandemic, because clearly these are extreme events which do matter. The protocol is very similar to this. Back then, this is from the US, of course, but India had very similar protocols. Masks were in vogue, of course. The most important, visual marker of that pandemic. One important thing out here is ventilation, and you'll see what's happened this year. Interesting. Last year, when the WHO protocols came out, ventilation was not a big deal, but in the last few months, the airborne nature of the coronavirus has kind of been confirmed systematically now. And suddenly ventilation is very high now, suddenly on public health protocols. So it's making a comeback. Interestingly for me, this was always there in the 1918 public health. Okay, so this is pretty much a summary of those pandemics. I'm going to end with this slide on the legacies. Why are these things important apart from the diseases themselves and so on? One is the modern public health system that we really have, whether it is the way we do the research, bacteriology as a pioneer. A lot of the stuff that we take for granted emerged, it traces its roots in the age of pandemics, specifically to combat the pandemics, right? So for example, these guys were obsessed about cholera to curtail cholera, and that's pretty much how they hit upon various theories. Robert Koch got a lot of his discoveries around that. If you think about World Health Organization as a multilateral organization, it traces its roots to 1851, where the first so-called international conference was held to stop cholera from coming out of the Indian subcontinent into Europe. Right. And so they held repeated conferences from 1851, all the way to the 1920s and so on. And it's those conferences which gave the officials the kind of intellectual kind of bandwidth to eventually form something called as the WHO. Right. So the roots of the WHO lie in combating the cholera pandemic of 1850. So when you look at the WHO today, its roots, actually intellectual roots, lie in 1851. When you look at many of the stuff that we're seeing, like vaccines, a lot of this, medical stuff you're seeing, it has its roots to combat the pandemics of the age of pandemics. In India, more specifically, of course, we're dealing with COVID with a law passed in 1897, plague, vaccine development. I've already talked about this. Interestingly, India's urban planning also traces its roots to the plague, in the sense that it's only after the plague that pandemic management comes into light in a big way, and we get something called as the Bombay Improvement Trust. In these improvement trusts, which are the forerunners for our development authorities, started there. Not many people know that the cooperative movement got a huge push in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, because a lot of the leaders of the cooperative movement were people who were working in plague management, right? Because remember, plague management required people to evacuate entire villages and towns. This requires organizational skill, right? And so not surprisingly, people with those organizational skills were tapped into both the political movement and the cooperative movement. The freedom movement, we learn our history about the freedom movement with virtually no understanding of pandemics. Interestingly, 1857, the rise of the Congress and the rise of Gandhi, I would argue, all had a pandemic kind of an origin. The 1857 uprising happened after a major cholera outbreak in the start of the year. In fact, there's research which shows that garrison towns with more intensity of that cholera outbreak arguably had more mutiny, right? So there's interesting research on that. So 1857, you can say, had something to do with the cholera pandemic. The rise of leaders like Tilak, Gokhale in Pune, Sardar Patel, who was, his first big role in public policy was in Ahmedabad in 1817, when he was a member of the sanitation committee dealing with plague in the Ahmedabad municipality. So a lot of the stars of India's freedom movement kind of, got their, early spurs working in pandemic management. And of course, Gandhi, it's not coincidental that Gandhi's rise really happens 1918, 19 onwards. And that's because of this mass misery that influenza kind of inflicts upon India in that particular. Lesser known is the labor movement. I pointed out in the book, the labor movement in India picks off in the 1920s, because one of the things pandemics do, especially deadly pandemics, which strike out a significant percentage of the population, is that it can also tilt the balance of power towards labor away from capital, in the sense that workers get more bargaining power because they're labor supply shortage, right? And so it's not a surprise that trade unionism, a lot of the kind of labor rights movements that starts off in a big way in the 1920s can be traced back to a particular demographic episode, which is the influenza pandemic. This is also noted, by the way, in the Royal Commission of Labor. So that report actually says that influenza was the inflection point. And I've also looked at newspaper records to see when does the discourse on labor really start, and it starts only after the influenza pandemic. Okay, we can talk about this in the Q&A. I'll just point out the way to think about pandemics and migration is that there will always be an incentive to go back home. It is easy to curtail international migration. It is impossible to curtail internal migration, as we saw last year. And that is why sending migrant workers back home at the onset of the pandemic makes more sense than sending them after. I've discussed a lot of this, but I'll end with what I call as the stages of a pandemic. And that is that when I looked at this past pandemics, I was writing this book, remember, in 2020. I thought that this is a useful way to characterize it. That first up, there's denial. People live in denial mode, saying nothing can happen to us. Then there's complete confusion as to what to do. Then there's some sort of an acceptance that, okay, we have to deal with this and we're going to survive this. And then there's erasure, which means unlike wars which get memorialized, the pandemics kind of quickly disappear out of our memories. And it seems to me that we've run through all of this. When I was writing the book, I was talking about this in terms of a 100-year perspective. But before the second wave, I think what we've seen is a kind of a run through all of this. That is, it seemed almost, after November last year, there seemed to have been a very quick erasure of that entire experience. And a lot of chest thumping, a lot of exceptionalism kind of narratives were peddled around. And I end the book with these two words, patience and humility. If there's anything that history tells us, is that to get through a pandemic, you need immense amount of patience and immense amount of humility. To say stuff like we've defeated the pandemic and so on, and the British also said this, by the way, in 1896, 1897, plague haunted India for 20 additional years. Right? So pandemics are very strange creatures. One has to have patience and humility in order to deal with it. I'll end now. Happy to take questions. I run a history internship at IMA in case anyone's interested, and also have a social media handle called BizEconHist on Twitter and Instagram, in case any of you are on these. All right, thanks.
Thank you, Professor Tumbe, for such an amazing talk on pandemics. I mean, your book actually not only documents the history to the science, but also the science to the history. And probably that could have been one of the best reminders for signaling the outbreak of the second wave, and who knows, maybe the third wave as well. Anyways, we'll leave the floor open for questions. Please raise your hand or put it on the chat box. Yeah, Shailendra.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, Shailendra.
How are you?
Hi, thanks, Professor Tumbe, for this wonderful talk. I have been following lately your this work that few journalists are, compiling these death figures. But that apart, I had a different question. There is a tribe, a rat-eating tribe in India, particularly in Bihar. I don't know anywhere else. Did you find any mention in your in the research that you did? Any conjecture about plague and this rat-eating tribe?
It's a nice observation. Firstly, hi Shailendra, how are you? It's a nice observation. Across, but I did come across one reference in the Arthashastra on rats, which I found very fascinating and which I point out in the book. The Arthashastra, interestingly, it has certain things about what the kingdom should do and so on. And one of the things it says is that you have to beware of rats. And they also mention something like a rat tax, right? That is a certain proportion of rats have to be delivered to the king, and some sort of a rat tax quota that they mention in the Arthashastra. Now, this is a very ancient treaty. I found it interesting that many of the things mentioned in the Arthashastra were actually there in practice in the early 20th century. So in terms of this thing, in terms of basically taking into account that rats can be dangerous, keeping rats away from humans, and this idea of rat tax, because the Bombay municipality basically started paying people to get rats to them, incentivizing rat catching. This, by the way, had a perverse incentive in Vietnam, because if you pay people to catch rats, they basically started breeding rats to get more money and so on. So breed rats, kill them, and get the money. So those sort of perverse incentives were in place. There are a lot of references to rats in history, which I mentioned, but I've not come across this. But I do mention the Musahar community in Bihar, because this is a community which hugely entered the rat catching activity, which the municipalities of some of the small towns in Bihar started in the early 20th century. So I don't have any specific information of the particular tribe we're talking about, but definitely this social group in Bihar got into rat catching in a huge way. So that's the only thing I know about Bihar, rat catching and social.
Yeah, that's the community. That's the community I was referring to. Musahar is the rat-eating community. That's how. So they had this expertise in rat catching, and so they that's why they may have been commissioned for that work.
Yeah. So that's the So the origins of that, I'm clueless. But now that you mention it, it's very interesting, and I think I should do more research on this to find out. They got into this. So firstly, when did the causality, in the sense, did they get into this after they were employed? But I think your thing is more plausible, that they were already dealing with rats, and that's how they were hired in this, which then begs the question as to how they got into this practice in the first place, which I think is a very important question. But I don't have the answer. And Ramya's point on temple.
I know them.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, Ramya's point, temple for rats is mentioned in the book. I mentioned this particular temple in the starting of the plague chapter. But again, we don't really know as to why this is there. Interesting. I mean, of course, most famously, my mother's obsessed with Ganpati, and Ganpati has, rodent on its side. So probably one of the most famous gods in India has a rodent as the escort. So that's the other famous rodent in Indian history. And of course, China has the year of the rat, right? So that's the other rodent in kind of the zodiac signs in China. So there are a lot of rat references, of course, in history. But I'm curious about this. The Arthashastra one has not been really noted. So I'm going to claim that I'm the first one to speculate that the Arthashastra could have been referring to plague in ancient history. Open speculation. But I've not seen any medical historians talk about that. I found references from Mughal times. I found references in a variety of sources. Some of it I have mentioned in the book. But that's the thing. You see, a lot of diseases are almost unidentified in history. If you say fever, it could be malaria, it could be flu, it could be anything. Right? If you say, passing stools, it could be diarrhea, it could be cholera, it could be so many things. Right? So it's very difficult. Medical history is a very tough field to identify disease specific. Plague is interesting because if it's about rats dying as a classic symbol, it's been recorded so many times. And so that's why the references to plague seem to be much more, at least in India, than many other. Smallpox also easy to identify because you get those marks on your body. But with malaria, malaria has been the deadliest disease in history. But we have few direct references because all you can say is, fever. Now, fever can happen for so many other reasons. So that's also an interesting point on how to research on these diseases.
So the next question is from Kumar. Kumar, if you can, Kumar Shrestha.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, Chinmay, I just want to know, how did you lay your hands on the resources? Like I found some Times of India cuttings here and there. You have actually put it down.
Yeah.
So how did you find those resources? Because they seem to be. I just want to know what was your method.
Sure. Yeah, sources. Yeah, sources are always most important question that any history work gets. I mean, the first thing historians ask is, what are your sources? This is the most important question of historians. So statistics, there's all these statistical reports which the British compiled. Newspaper reports are hugely valuable. Thankfully, the Times of India today, anybody can do research because the ProQuest has digitized every article pretty much of the Times of India. So I think, I think most libraries, not most, but a lot of libraries in India subscribe to this. It's called the ProQuest Times of India Historical Research Database. It's probably the only good historical newspaper archive we have digitized. Virtually every article of the Times of India from 1838 to now pretty much has been digitized. Right? So it's a phenomenal kind of database. So I got, one task was to get an intern to basically just go through these three words, cholera, plague, influenza, and get, all the newspaper articles. But that's not the only thing. There's Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, NMML in Delhi. They store about 300 plus newspapers from the late 19th century in microfilm form, right? So when you go there, it's a very painful task. So compared to the ProQuest, which is like, search, click, download kind of a thing, there you have to go, you have to file requisition form, then you get that film, then you have to put the light, then the light will show. And so I've gone through a lot of newspapers. I've still not finished, exhausted that, whole thing. But influenza was simple because it happens only for a few months. So I've gone through a lot of newspapers in Delhi to find out stuff on influenza. And of course, for regional newspapers, different archives, basically, if they have source. But I would say as a single, if anyone's doing work through newspaper reports, which are very valuable information, NMML probably has the best repository of newspaper-related information in India. For many parts, like Bihar has had a newspaper called Searchlight. Right? The Searchlight was a famous English newspaper of Bihar for almost 80-90 years. And virtually every issue of the Searchlight is there in digitized form at the NMML in Delhi. So that's how one goes about newspaper report. I found, the tough part for me was not newspaper account, but first-person references. How did people experience the pandemic? So oral history, I found one or two. It's very tough. Most people from those times are dead. So unlike partition or unlike, say, 1971 war, not too many people living, so you can't ask them questions. So that was kind of ruled out, though I did find one from Central India. But I went through a lot of memoirs, autobiographies of people written through that period. And you find it, you find references. And the book which which was really the eye-opener for me, was a memoir from it's a Marathi autobiography translated in English by Shanta Gupli. The autobiography is of Lakshmibai Tilak. And Lakshmibai Tilak wrote this autobiography roughly in the 1930s, but she lived through that period, 80s to 1930. She has described in great detail and vivid detail of how they experienced the plague, how she contracted plague, she was about to die, miraculously she survived. And she has detailed chapters, not just the plague, but also influenza. They didn't call it influenza, they called it Manmudi, separate name, but it happens in 1980s, so it is definitely influenza. And a lot of this research serendipity, that is, you go through enough memoirs and you try to find something. Chitra was an eye-opener, like in passing reference. So you try and collect all collected works of all these, relatively, and so you try and put a picture of some of those first person. The really tough part for me was written during the lockdown, which meant that I was on a lot of digital courses. So for me, it was a trade-off. I could have taken 2-3 more years, and the book could have been much better researched. But I really wanted the book out in 2020. I thought, okay, let me as much as required to write the book. But I have not. I would say that the book is out. I'm continuously collecting references even today. So I have a spreadsheet where I collect. So for example, on Twitter, I gather first-person references. So people said, "Oh, my grandmother told me about this, and she had died, she who had influence." And then he or she tells me a story. So I'm capturing these memories. Right? So it's, while the book is out, this is still a live project about collecting sources. And influence, cholera plague still for so many years has been written about that. But influenza happened so quickly and got forgotten so quickly, it's really tough. If you read the newspaper reports of October, November, 1918, obviously everyone is talking only about influenza. It's like reading the newspapers of, say, April and May 2021. Right? Every front page headline is about COVID. That's exactly what happened back then. Right? So newspaper reports were very useful for influenza in particular. So some of the, and when I was writing the book, I didn't expect to see many of the things which were mentioned back then. Right? So, for example, bodies floating in Ganga. Right? This is something which I had not anticipated in 2020. I did not think things would get that bad. So when the reports came out of that in April this year, these are news clips I have seen in the past. Right? So for me, it was like a jarring reflection. Or classic, things, people get the wrong body at the hospital. This happened. What one might call almost dark humor in a tragedy, right? And newspapers are quick to latch onto that. I've come across so many such stuffs, right? An increase in obituaries in the newspapers, what we've seen this year, same thing happening back then. So a lot of, for me, a lot of similarities in the sources I've seen then and what now I'm observing in a live sense, this year. And that's why I've taken it upon myself now to kind of estimate how many people died, in this pandemic, because I've done this for 1918. And so now I see myself as someone who, calculates deaths in a pandemic. So that's my task for this year. And, there are a lot of us working on this in different ways. But it's a tragedy that we've still not released a lot of our death statistics, not the official number, not the COVID numbers, but the all-cause mortality statistics. It's a shame that state governments are not releasing this. No state government has made this systematically. UK and all are releasing this on a daily basis. Every day, how many people died overall, not just COVID, overall, is known at a granular level on a daily basis. This is what you should be doing in a pandemic. We are for our last data point for all the districts of India is 2018, right? And in a pandemic, we have not made this information available. However, the information does exist in certain portals, and so all of us are scraping this, these websites. And now we've got estimates. We now know for sure that more than 500,000 people have died, what so-called excess deaths, in just 4 states of India, comprising about 20% of India's population. Madhya Pradesh, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, and Tamil Nadu. These 4 states, we have good estimates of excess deaths. In the first 5 months of 2021, we now know that more than 500,000 people have died in these 4 states. The reported numbers for the same period in those 4 states is 46,000 COVID deaths. So it's an underreporting factor of more than 10. So that's the kind of dissonance we're seeing in today's statistics.
So I think Abhijit M.
Yeah.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Chinmay. Of course, I'm going to buy your book. There was an interesting observation that there's an interesting thing that I observed when you told that the plague or a particular type of rat was involved in the plague, and that was like kind of endemic to the Bombay province and the United Province of, North Indian province. Uh, it kind of hit me because diversity also plays a role. Like I'm from Kerala right now, and we saw this Nipah outbreak happen in northern Kerala, and that was from bats. Now it's not that all the bats are involved. There are a certain type of bats, and there's this recent controversy over bats being studied in Nagaland, but we haven't seen any of these outbreaks in the northeastern states. So have there been any references towards how diversity is of these carriers, how they have been influenced in
Yeah, I think there are
pandemic?
two parts to this. One is what there's a good book by the way called Spillover. It basically says, what are the circumstances under which the likelihood of spillovers, that is diseases transmitted from animals to humans, takes place. And there's diversity in that, right? And that is why pandemics can start theoretically from any part of the world. It's not like some places are more prone to generate pandemics, right? I mean, the so-called Spanish flu, by most most people, we still don't know the exact origins, but the kind of classical origins of the so-called Spanish flu is America, right? So it's more like the American flu, so to speak, not the Spanish flu. So you're right that the spillover could happen potentially anywhere, but obviously diseases are so different. I have in this background, there's a particular book called the Encyclopedia of Human Diseases. But there are just so many diseases, right? And there's so many diseases endemic in different parts of the world. So we really don't know what, there's Ebola, there's HIV. We don't know at what time what is going to spill over. And now, obviously, one has to take precautions. We're working in a lab, right? That's a completely different issue. But there is diversity, and that is why the larger takeaway from that map and from what you're saying is that we should not be quick to rush to make proclamations on the regional mortality variations that we observe, right? And we did this mistake last year because we said that, if you looked at the data, classically, look at economic survey document of this year, it shows India versus 19 other countries which are doing much worse than us, okay? USA, Germany, UK, on a per capita mortality basis. And it kind of gives you the feeling that, India is doing very well. Actually, even before the second wave hit us, we were somewhere in the middle, in the sense, if you look at 200 countries of the world, on a mortality per capita basis, we were the worst performing in South Asia. And in Asia, we were not doing particularly well. And it was a mystery. It was an open mystery as to why the so-called Western countries were much more hit by COVID than others. And everyone had their pet theory, right? So from BCG vaccination to hygiene hypothesis to a variety of things. But I think the correct way to think about it as scientists who are working on this field, and good scientists did tell us, saying we simply don't know enough right now, right, as to why it is being hit so much more. And there were hypotheses, but as we've seen with past pandemics, these hypotheses take time to kind of get confirmed. And now we know that one hypothesis makes no sense, which is the immunity hypothesis, because if 500,000 people are dead in 4 states of India, that's a huge calamity. So we are weeding out different hypotheses, and we'll get to know only by but unfortunately much later. But there's incremental knowledge which we're learning about these. So one has to be very careful about regional variations in mortality. And of course, in India, where there's such differences in reporting standards, right? I mean, I'm most probably going to have a newspaper article on this in a few days. If you look at per capita COVID deaths in Madhya Pradesh and Karnataka, right, both ruled by the same political party, you would, if you saw the newspapers of the last 3 months, you would think that it's much more dangerous to live in Karnataka than Madhya Pradesh. Why? Because reported COVID deaths per capita in Karnataka was something like 3 or 4 times more than Madhya Pradesh's reported COVID deaths per capita. It now turns out that the excess deaths per capita in Madhya Pradesh is much more than in Karnataka. Right? It just flips the whole order. It's not even like, it's completely reordering the ranking of Indian states based on per capita mortality. So that's how bad, or that's how big the underreporting kind of factors vary across. So we have to be very cautious in drawing out any inferences from regional variations at this point.
So with your due permission, we'll take a couple of questions from the chat
Sure.
box.
Yeah.
There's one question by Manhar who asks, what's this? Yeah. Pandemics and epidemics are particularly known to be events or phases. So he asks about Muslims being targeted for the initial spread. So is there any evidence of such a work on historical incidents in the past?
Yeah, I mean, my book actually mentions a lot of this. So, I mean, historically, Black Deaths or Jews being persecuted, big time in Europe, plague and Jews persecution. In India, for example, Ambedkar has pointed out that as late as in the 1940s, a woman was in a particular village burnt, put to the stake basically, on the possibility that she had brought cholera to the village, right? And happened to be, in the language of those times, untouchable, right? And so clearly, social norms did dictate about what people thought were people who brought the diseases, right? Because what epidemics and pandemics do essentially is that we're all looking for who is getting it to our region. And so we're all looking for scapegoating, as you rightly pointed out. And in India, classically, this would happen at the village level, blaming people of historically marginalized castes. Right? And so Ambedkar has that one reference, but I point out in the book about various such caste-related differences, in terms of treatment, in terms of discrimination, if not outright persecution, for what Ambedkar noted. The British, they had completely different norms for what Christians could do vis-a-vis what Muslims and Hindu pilgrims, for example, could do, right? And so, you could say that there was huge discrimination from the state. And so Hindu pilgrims and Muslim pilgrims were seen down upon for nearly a century. And the argument from the Indian side was, I think, much more sensible, saying that, look, you're saying that these pilgrim sites spread diseases, then why don't you do something about it? In the sense, why don't you provide better sanitation facilities at these sites? Right? Because we are doing these pilgrims for thousands of years. How can you stop this? Which I think is a very fair position. So you could say that a lot of groups were targeted. Right? Pilgrims as a group was targeted big time by the British. Both the Hajj and with its Haridwar, Kumbh Mela, which was stopped in a few years. By the way, on the point of Kumbh, in Cholera, by the 1930s, 40s, it was compulsory to show your cholera vaccination certificate before going to some of these pilgrims. So that's also one learning of the past. So I would say the book does have references to some of this, and it's fair to say that pandemics do create more anxiety, and people are trying to point out who is this. There's also class divide. Typically, the rich see the poor as being the causative agents of the disease, right? It's interesting because last year when COVID broke out, a lot of the migrant workers' first reaction was, this is the rich person's disease, right? Because people from abroad have come and got this disease, and why are we made, because they were suffering from that lockdown, why are we made to pay the price for the rich person's disease? Now that notion has gone because the wave 2 is so different that everyone's been affected much. But I'll tell you, like in London, when cholera hit, there are kind of reports capturing this. Some of the poor apparently thought that this is a way of the rich to get rid of them, right? So that's also a perception, seeing that the poor are seeing the disease as being thrust upon them by the rich in order to kind of cleanse them. So interesting how these perceptions throughout his history have been formed from all sides. The poor are blaming the rich are blaming the poor. The Indians are blaming the British are blaming the Indians. But at the root, as you point out, is scapegoating, right? Because we don't know enough, and we are actively looking for someone to blame. Right? And so that's where the whole, and I think that's a learning from pandemics, is the humility, that it's better to say we don't know rather than just going on hammering it at certain groups.
So the next question is from Anirvinna. Would you agree with the current pandemic emanating from China, that Chinese virus theory that you talked about? And
sure. Yeah. In my book, I'm very critical about China because in the last chapter called COVID-19 in the rearview mirror, and I start off by pointing out a quote from the Arthashastra on good ground surveillance. China was very late in reporting to the WHO, so that is definitely a clear fault of the Chinese government. So, I'm critical of China in the book. At the time of writing the book, of course, not enough was known. And so in that book, I don't speculate or do anything about the origins of the COVID pandemic. But as you know, I think as most people on this chat would know, the probability of the lab leak hypothesis has increased substantially over the last few weeks with the evidence compiled by a lot of people around the world, especially a person called the Seeker, who's based apparently in Eastern India. And so if you're asking me like where do I think the pandemic started, I'm just going to say, look, I don't know. We know for sure that Wuhan seems to be ground zero, right? Wuhan thereabouts. Now, whether it's a natural transmission from the animal to human kind of transmission, or whether it is a lab leak, right? These seem to be the primary kind of hypothesis. And I think there's still not enough information. Even the lab leak hypothesis, what people are basically pointing out is that the Wuhan Institute of Virology has not been transparent, and hence they must be hiding. Right? But that's still not clinching evidence. I mean, we're still looking for clinching evidence. Right? So while I'm not ruling it out, I simply feel that at this point there's simply not enough evidence. So in the balance of probabilities, yes, it's slightly higher, but it's still not 100%. The third hypothesis, which is that the Chinese government purposely did it to harm the world, maybe can be ruled out. And I would put a very low probability on that. So I think these are the two contending things: natural transmission and the lab leak hypothesis. And of course, this is I don't think this will ever end, because conspiracy theories are so attractive that now with all the things that have been known in the last week, the cover-ups by the scientific academy in China and so on, it's all pointing towards saying, oh, something must not be right. But from going to something must not be right to saying, look, it actually happened, there's still a gap out there. So that's where I think most people who are following this story, I think, stand right now.
Thank you.
The question also, do you think India did its best given huge problem? That's a big question in the sense, did we do our best? Right? All I'll say is, look, pandemic management is very tough. Okay, hard trade-offs are involved, lives versus livelihoods. Whatever you say, the government is damned if it does, damned if it doesn't. All I'll say is that the scientific approach, right, seems to have changed substantially in the Indian government's scientific approach from 2020 to 2021. I would say our response in 2020 was much more measured in scientific terms. Yes, we got a migration crisis. I've been critical of that. But in the idea was right, that is, we need to flatten the curve. I don't think the Indian government, did anything which was unscientific in 2020. But from 2021 early on, a lot of us were concerned about the evidence-less triumphalism. It was not rooted in science. A classic document to look at is, as I said, the economic survey. If you look at the economic survey chapter defending how great the government had done with COVID by comparing with the 10 worst performers and not the 200 countries that we know of, that kind of told you that the government is going into a slippery slope. Now what we know is COVID task force meetings did not happen regularly. We know that not enough investment was done in tracking the strains of the viruses, which is the most fundamental thing you should be doing in a pandemic. And as a researcher working on migration, mortality, demographic statistics, I am most pained by this fact that the death registration system statistics are not yet released on a daily basis for every district of India. This is what we should have done in March last year. Right? Why? Because that is one number which will tell you how badly things are going on the ground, not your reported COVID numbers. In rural Madhya Pradesh and UP, there is no testing facility, but there are deaths happening. Our protocol on understanding, that is something where we have slipped up big time, I think. Our insistence that you can be counted as COVID dead only if you're COVID positive by a test. Right? And so we need to move away. So I'm now hugely pushing this. Yeah, so that's that's what I would say. It's great that we have vaccines which are manufactured, some of them developed in India. These are the positives, right? And so we need to build on the positives. We have, though our population is vast, we do have access to the capacity. Many countries are worse off than us because they simply don't have access to any vaccine supplies. Right? So in that sense, we have certain advantages even now, despite all that we've gone through. So we have to build onto that and ensure that we vaccinate the bulk of the population as fast as possible. That's one way in which we can reduce the dangers of the pandemic. Ultimately, it's tough. I mean, I'm not saying that that even if you do everything by the science book, things can get bad, as we've seen in Germany, as we've seen in France.
So thank you for the amazing session. I think the questions are coming in and at a very large pace, and I think, I'm sorry, maybe we're running out of time now. So, I mean, it's been an amazing talk by Professor Tumbe. I mean, having read your book, I mean, it started with that beautiful story about your son asking you about pandemics. I'll kind of end the session by a small question with reference to that story that hit me. The fact that children these concept of pandemics has got ingrained in the minds of the children right from day one these days. Have you got evidence in terms of habits of people changing after the pandemic, say maybe young and old, in the previous years?
It's tough. I think the behavioral difference now is mainly because of the lockdowns, and for children, the fact that you're learning, many of them are learning computers and so on. I would say, back then you had pandemic induced lockdowns in the sense that people are too scared to venture out once the epidemic is raging. But you never really saw government mandated lockdowns like we've seen now in such a all India kind of level. Right? And so I would definitely say the response across the world has been much more dramatic, right, than any time in the past. And that's why I think the behavioral kind of memory or the changes are also much more stark, especially for kids in their learning atmosphere, the fact that they can't go out and so on. Earlier, I have not come across references saying, oh, you have to stay at home and so on, for instance. So the enforcement of the lockdowns is much more stringent at the all India level, I would say, this time around. So yeah, it's a tough question. If I find something, it might be intriguing to look at it. But I think the behavioral changes that we are making right now are much more dramatic than any previous pandemic in the past. And in a way for the good, in the sense that arguably if we had a business as usual approach, like say 1918, 1918 people wore masks and so on, but they didn't have a national lockdown. Arguably we would be seeing many, many more millions of deaths. Right? So it's hard to say how many lives have been saved, right? But definitely by ensuring some restrictions, I do think these restrictions to a certain extent are important and are saving lives.
Thank you, sir. And, it's been an amazing session, as I mentioned, and hope to see you in campus. I mean, we remember you having talked on your migration book. We would have loved to hear you in person, but anyways, even the virtual world has really worked.
Yeah, as I say, demography has three pillars: migration, mortality, and fertility. Now that I've given a talk with you guys on migration and mortality, I think it's only fair that next time I'll be talking something on fertility, but it's not going to happen.
Good luck with your research, and thank you for joining me.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Thanks to the other participants. Bye.